morning, good afternoon. Welcome everyone. We have people still joining, so we'll give it a little bit more time before we kick off this event on mental well-being and human development in uncertain times. Okay, so good morning, good afternoon, warm welcome to everyone who's joining us for today's discussion on mental well-being and human development in uncertain times. My name is Josephine Pasanen and I work in the research team at the Human Development Report Office, and I'll be moderating the event today. In today's uncertain times, where many interlinked global crises are adding pressures to people's lives and people's minds, it seems more important than ever to discuss and understand the linkages between human development and well-being and the policies that are needed to improve mental well-being around the world. And we have a great set of speakers today to discuss this and a very interesting agenda ahead. But before we jump into that, and I'll give you an overview of the agenda and sort of the housekeeping rules as well for the event, I would like to give the floor to Pedro Conceição, who is the director of the Human Development Report Office of UNDP and the lead author of the Human Development Report, to tell us, please, Pedro, that why do you think it's important that we talk about mental well-being and human development in uncertain times?
Thank you, Josephine. Thank you, colleagues, for joining us today. I also want to recognize Christina, the colleague in the research team that has been leading the work in our office on this topic, along with the contributions of Andrew joining us on the panel. And hopefully, this is the beginning of an ongoing conversation in which we're going to continue to explore the connections, linkages between mental well-being and human development, which is a topic that we traditionally have not given perhaps enough attention in our human development reports. But let me first just remind all of us what human development is. We can think of human development as an invitation really to look at progress by the extent to which people are able to be and do what they value and have reason to value. So to advance human development seen in this way, it's important to certainly increase standards of living, but it's also important to look at things like health and education, and beyond these aspects related to people's well-being, it's also important to understand the extent to which people feel they have autonomy, that are able to make choices in freedom to live their lives. And so the Human Development Reports are an attempt to take this perspective and use it to look at the world and to look at ongoing challenges and suggest ways of addressing them. Our latest Human Development Report is motivated by the recognition that, as Josephine alluded to, we are living in times that can be considered to be uncertain in new ways, perhaps not more uncertain than in the past, but times where we've been surprised again and again by things that we were not expecting, and that have consequences that have extended beyond what we initially thought would happen. So, for instance, COVID-19, something that started as a health crisis, really, quickly became an economic crisis and turned out to be also an education crisis. So to a large extent, we understand the challenges that we are confronting, and we know many of the things that we need to do. For instance, if we look at climate change, which is something that is also throwing at us more and more shocks and widening inequalities. We know a lot of the things that need to happen. We knew the things that we needed to put in place to prevent pandemics. And yet we seem to be not able somehow to give response to a lot of the challenges that we understand. So the latest Human Development Report asked why is it so difficult for us to come together to address the challenges, and part of it is the reality of a world that is changing around us in many new ways. So these times that are uncertain in new ways. But we also argue that it's because people's lives are being unsettled. So the title of the report is Uncertain Times and Unsettled Lives. So people's lives are certainly unsettled by poverty, by hunger, by violent conflict, by inflation. Many people are angry around the world, and we found that 6 out of every 7 people feel insecure today about many aspects of their life. So a widespread and pervasive sense of insecurity, of people not being perhaps fully in control of their lives. Many people also believe that things are not getting better. We find that half of the population in the world today does not see progresses in their living standards relative to that of their parents. So this is a bit of a paradox, because if we look at many of the objective indicators that we rely on to assess development progress, by many measures, things are getting better, and yet half of the population today does not believe that things are improving. It's not only about perceptions. We also document in our latest Human Development Report that for the first time on record, the Human Development Index, which is this measure that we rely on that combines indicators of standard of living, health, and education, dropped for the first time. This Human Development Index dropped 2 years in a row, both in 2020 and 2021. And the reason was in part the compounding crisis that I alluded to. So it's in part related to COVID-19, but COVID-19 not a health crisis, but the many manifestations that the COVID-19 had on many aspects of people's lives. In fact, the decline in the Human Development Index was driven both by economic recessions and declines in life expectancy at birth, which is the indicator we rely on to account for health. To come to what's bringing us together here in the seminar, I should say before I do that the report then elaborates on the reasons why lives are being unsettled, and also suggests some of the things that we consider doing to address the challenges. But what brings us together is one particular manifestation or impact of this unsettledness, which is related to a mental health crisis that is global and that is growing. In the report, we use the expression, we say that unsettled lives, unsettled minds. And so we know, for instance, that today, 1 in 8 people around the world suffer from mental health disorders. So this is not only extremely high number, but it's a number that has been growing. It's 10 percentage points than it was 10 years ago. So clearly this is a tragedy for people that are affected. But it's also, we argue, a major roadblock to advancing human development. Remember this idea of human development that I alluded to at the beginning. And so what we are going to explore in the time that we have together is to understand better how these threats to mental well-being are something that stands in the way of advancing human development, and also to look at what could we do to ease the suffering that's affecting so many people today, which is obviously intrinsically and important in its own right, but it's also something that can unlock greater progress on human development. So Josephine, I'll stop here and hand over back to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pedro. Thank you for setting the scene for the discussions we will have today. So let me quickly give you an overview of the agenda, which has also been posted in the chat for your reference. Our first session today will focus, as Pedro alluded to, on what mental well-being means for human development, how it's related to the challenges we're seeing now of the Anthropocene, and how we can think about measuring mental well-being. Our second session then will feature a discussion on the types of policies needed to improve mental well-being, with examples of efforts already taking place across the world. If you have any questions to our speakers, please use the Q&A function. We have a team ready to monitor the questions, and you can also use the chat for discussions, thoughts, and comments. With that said, our first speaker today is Christina Lengfelder, who is a research specialist at the Human Development Report Office and has worked on mental health issues for a long time. She's a co-author to our Human Development Report, and her research takes a holistic approach to human development, focusing, for example, on mental well-being and multidimensional inequalities. So Christina, over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Josephine, and thanks, Pedro, for the introduction. I'm going to dive right into chapter 2 of our report, which looks at how mental distress can be an obstacle to human development. And you see here on this, admittedly, a little abstract diagram, how this mechanism works based on the theoretical framework of the human development approach, or the capabilities approach. But I know that some might not be familiar with this approach, so I'm going to try to explain this on a very practical example with this little Nigerian girl here who has suffered violence under Boko Haram and has developed post-traumatic stress disorder. Part of her symptoms include trouble sleeping at night, difficulty concentrating in school, and a chronic migraine. So when this girl, even though she has access to a fairly good education, which we call means to achieve here, or resources, when she's in school, she can't concentrate because of her symptoms that I just mentioned of the post-traumatic stress disorder. Which is the mental distress that you see here in the function. That means that her individual convergent factors are different from those of her peers or of other children around the world, and that she has less freedom to achieve what she values in life than other children. And ultimately, she also has different achievements, which is at the end of the convergent function. That's what we call it. So that is why and how mental distress can compromise human development. And this effect is especially strong among children, and I'll explain with the help of this diagram why. So children's body and brain is still under development. And when toxic stress frequently or even constantly activates the stress response system, then that can lead to an overload of the biological system. And it does not only affect the brain and the nervous system, as you can see here, it also affects the neuroendocrine system, the immune system, so the defense that you have, the heart and cardiovascular system. And this, on a chronic basis, can lead to several physical health issues also during adulthood. or throughout life, for example, diabetes or obesity, and several others. And the development of body and brain is compromised when this starts early and during childhood. In the report, we also present some statistics, and Pedro has already mentioned some on mental health disorders, but the main point here that I would like to make is that it's still an ongoing effort, and Florence will talk about this a little more because she works at WHO, one of the organizations that works directly on these statistics. We only present them. The main point here is that most of these numbers are probably very much underestimated because it is so difficult to measure mental health problems. And one of the reasons is that there's still a lot of stigma around this topic. People are reluctant to report it. And a lot of times when people suffer, they don't necessarily identify their suffering as a mental health problem. When we go back to the example of the little girl from Nigeria, a chronic migraine not necessarily is identified as a mental health problem. And especially in a context where only about 10% of people who need mental health interventions receive it around the world. So that means if the problem is not identified as a mental health problem, it is not counted, and even more so if it's not professionally assessed. So I'm gonna dive deeper now into the chapter, and what we look at here is 5 characteristics of the Anthropocene and how they affect mental well-being. And I start here with 2 structural changes that we are going through. The first is the human pressure on the planet that compromises mental health. And I give some examples. So there can be, or there have been, many more traumatizing events due to extreme weather events like floods and hurricanes and droughts. Climate change has also led to physical illness, extreme heat, for example, and that compromises mental well-being as well. So you already see the relation is can be reversed as well. Mental health mental health problems can affect physical health, but physical illness can also lead to poorer mental well-being outcomes. We also look at how biodiversity loss affects indigenous populations and their mental well-being because of how they depend on biodiversity for their livelihood. And food security that has been on the rise lately again is a direct threat to mental health since it's so substantial for human survival. The other structural change that we look at is digitalization, and we find that this is actually a double-edged sword for mental well-being, because there are some benefits, like, for example, empowerment through increased access to information or more opportunity for virtual social engagement. But there's also a lot of burden, for example, information overload or false information, cybercrime, cyber harassment. Now on this graph, you see intergenerational cycles of economic insecurity and mental distress. And this is an interesting one because it is a circular relation, and it, as I said, it's intergenerational. So this starts in early childhood or even before birth, when financial shocks or unemployment or food insecurity or just constant low income or poverty affect the mother's mental well-being that is transmitted already to the fetus in the mother's womb. Then if this is continued and constant, it has an adverse effect on the brain and body development that I explained earlier, and can lead to impaired cognitive functions and mental and physical health. when these children grow up, they often face more difficulty to find employment, or they face an income penalty when they have developed mental health disorders. They can also have higher health expenditure because of this. And finally, they are often increased to, they are often exposed to increased stressors in their life because of their whole situation that they face, which a lot of times is then similar to the situation that their parents faced with economic insecurity. And that again leads to worsening mental health. And then we are here at the cycle. If these adults have children on their own, the cycle starts over again with their children. And this is not meant to say that there is no way out and this is a cycle of negativity. This is meant to be a wake-up call that we need to do more for mental well-being, and we need to increase access to mental health treatments also. The next characteristic of the Anthropocene that we look at is violence, and we divide that into collective violence and interpersonal violence. And when we say collective violence, we look at armed conflict specifically, but also at political violence in general that has increased, as you can see here on the graph, throughout the past decade. And we find really terrible rates of post-traumatic stress disorder in areas of conflict. As you see here, for example, in Gaza, 87% of the children exposed to bombings have post-traumatic stress disorder. And I already explained what consequences that can have for the children's life and also for human development in general. I'm not sure if I mentioned that at the beginning, but one factor here is also inequality. So I think I did say that the little Nigerian girl has a different conversion function, different freedoms to achieve than her peers, but this is also true for horizontal inequalities. We call that group inequalities. That means inequality between groups of people. And when you look at these rates now here, so this has consequences for the freedoms to achieve of a whole group of people, and that increases inequalities between different groups of people as well. So I just said we have another example on interpersonal violence, and this specifically is about intimate partner violence. And this graph shows you how intimate partner violence goes hand in hand with economic dependence. And we measure that here by means of female labor force participation rate. And that is only because there's more data on this. Intimate partner violence most certainly can happen in same-sex partnerships as well. And we have also domestic violence in the case of elderly, for example. And it is similar, applicable, what I'm going to talk about, to those cases. It's just that the data is here to make it visual for you to see the relation. So this graph means that the less females, or we'll make it the other way around, the more females participate in the labor force, the less incidences of intimate partner violence we have. And while we all know that a correlation is not necessarily a causation, in this case, we found a lot of evidence in the literature that there is a causal relationship, and that is usually because when we live in a setting of intimate partner violence, it starts with isolation, constant criticism, verbal abuse, and that can lead to even to loss of self-identity of the person who is abused. A lot of times that leads to a withdrawal from the labor force, and then we have this cycle of economic dependence where the perpetrator controls the financial resources of the household and violently abuses the partner. And this, of course, coming back to the topic of mental well-being, this has severe consequences on in this case, the women's mental well-being, and also the children who live in the same household. The last characteristic we look at is discrimination, and that can also be interpersonal or structural. You have here some examples of minority groups, some ethnic groups, for example, people of color, LGBTQI+ people, and you see here some statistics on that, because it is really terrible to see how high the prevalence of the most common mental disorders are among this group of people. We have extremely high anxiety and depression rates. What you look at here is a survey. This was actually a national survey. All the other statistics that I presented were global, but this is national from the US. Extremely high rates also here of discrimination in the first place, but then the mental health symptoms, and generally also that people feel worthless or hopeless. Then the last, and I know I'm running out of time probably, Josephine, the last item here is the structural and systemic discrimination. And we have some examples in the report of the Rohingya and Yazidi populations that have experienced systemic discrimination with effects on their mental health. And as I mentioned earlier, this is a case of systemic or group issue around mental well-being, because we have here the impact on a whole group, which again can lead to inequality between different groups of people. But coming to an end here, this last diagram tries to summarize the whole argument. Oops, something went black. I'm not sure if this is just my, oh, no, there it is again. So you see on top here the 5 characteristics of the Anthropocene that I went through with you, and their effect on mental well-being, which is here starting in childhood or even before birth. And then we go through the whole conversion function that I already explained. This is the mental distress in adulthood, and it goes back to when the adults have children again. But what I just wanted to point out also is that we do, as I said, this is not meant to be a cycle of negativity and no way out. We do also lay out some tasks for people and policymakers. And it's 3 layers of tasks. The first one is to prevent situations that cause distress in the first place. And the whole UN system works on this day and night, I feel. So preventing that means stopping climate change, for example, preventing violence, preventing food insecurity, and so on. Since this is not always possible, and we know that very well, the second layer is mitigating crisis. That means providing emergency food and shelter in case of, for example, natural disasters and so on. And the third layer, and this is especially relevant for mental well-being, is to build resilience, and that include to increase access to mental health treatment as well. As we heard at the beginning, this is really an area where there is really a lot of need for improvement to get people access to mental health treatments. And we will hear a little more about that during the policy discussion. But for now, I'll hand over to my colleague Florence from WHO, who will talk on measurement, because usually what is not adequately measured or counted, it doesn't receive the proportion of funding that is necessary. And I think we'll hear about that more from our colleagues who work on policies as well, because that is a huge issue still around mental health and mental well-being, that there is just not enough funding for treatment. So for now, I'll hand over to back to Josephine to introduce my colleague. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Christina. So building on what Christina presented on the interlinkages between human development and the mental well-being, and how mental distress can have or be a hurdle to human development, we'll hear from Florence Baigana, who is a psychiatrist and public health specialist, and she's the WHO African Regional Advisor on mental, neurological, and substance use disorders. And she has a long background working on mental health issues within the African region with various multilateral organizations, and specifically thinking about how to measure these things, because as Christina alluded to when she started the presentation, this can be quite a tricky area to navigate in due to various stigmas or other challenges when it comes to metrics. So we'll hear from Florence now. Please, Florence, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Josefina. It was a huge pleasure listening to Christine. I read the chapter. I read the whole document actually and enjoyed it very much, but it was good to hear it being presented again. Just a disclaimer, data is not really, this is not my main area of work, but I do have an interest. So my area of work is being regional advisor for the first 47 countries you see there, trying to strengthen mental health systems. So I have 10 minutes, just 1 second, I set up my timer. Okay, this is the overview of the presentation. I will not be going through it word for word. I want to start off with a few reflections on chapter 2, and there are only 2 major ones. I really enjoyed reading it, and it made a good point about how mental well-being measures do not capture the full dimensional uncertainties that lead to mental well-being. So measuring mental health per se seems not to really reflect what it is that we want to measure about mental well-being, and the recommendation to broaden the concept of progress. So how do we measure progress? Is it only the Human Development Index? And I know at one time the measure was the Happiness Index, but both of them still don't quite come to what it is that we may be wanting to measure.
Sorry to interrupt you. I don't know if it's only on my end, but we're not seeing your slides in case you're trying to share them.
Yes, I'm sharing. You don't see them?
No,
Is
unfortunately not.
Oh, let me try again then. Oh dear.
So while Florence is trying to share them, let me remind you that you can post your questions and comments in the Q&A and the chat function, and we'll be ready to
Do you see them?
To answer.
You
No,
still don't see them? Oh
not.
dear, not sure what happened. It says your screen sharing, and I thought they were showing.
Yes,
Oh,
unfortunately
my
not,
internet.
but perhaps we can go on still.
I will go on. Maybe the internet will pick up speed and you eventually see them. Yeah, sorry about that.
Go ahead.
So yeah, very sorry. It says I'm screen sharing. So one area I wanted to discuss away from the report is what is in a name. We have mental distress, we have mental disorder, mental health condition, psychosocial disability, and then we have mental health, mental well-being, and then we also have symptoms of a mental health condition which do not translate into it being a mental health condition. So that term itself is not one thing, it can be very many different things. It can be on a spectrum. And then on the other side, sometimes when we say mental health within the work that I do, when I say mental health, I often include alcohol and substance use disorders. We sometimes include epilepsy and some of the other neurological disorders, but meningitis is included under infectious disorders and stroke under cardiovascular disorders. So that is always the challenge. What is it? What is that entity? Mental health, it's not one thing like you would say malaria or HIV. So the purpose of measurement is also important to consider. For instance, when measurement is being done for school-going children or children in conflict with the justice system, it should not just measure the mental well-being of the children, but it should include something else. What is it that is causing them to be where they are? Or what accommodations do they need in order to benefit from the schooling? Like was mentioned about that child, the Nigerian child, what measuring her PTSD per se did not lead to the accommodations that she needed in order to benefit from being in school. Then we do have a measure, the global scale for early child development, which is in development. It's actually being validated. No diagnosis is made, but it is able to inform resource allocation and programming so that children can reach their developmental potential. So this is one example. This is for early child development. You won't get a diagnosis, but you do get something. You can do something about what you think is not going right. Some of the other areas why we do measurement is to track the mental well-being of a population as a way of tracking outcomes such as effective service coverage with mental health services, we believe should lead to a decrease in the prevalence of mental health conditions. However, even if you treat somebody with a mental health condition and they are in remission or they are in recovery, they're still called, or they call themselves, I am a person with lived experience. Just like you may be a person living with a cardiovascular disorder, even if it is well controlled. So you would still measure the prevalence and the prevalence would remain the same, but we haven't measured the positive outcome of having reduced the symptoms or increased functioning and productivity. And I believe these are the ones that we want to be measuring: increasing productivity, increasing functioning, increasing well-being. So what are the challenges with measurement? These have to do with symptoms versus disorders. Sometimes some of the surveys that are carried out actually look at symptoms and not the disorder, not the diagnosis. And the ones looking at symptoms tend to overestimate. There has to be validation against the gold standard if you're using a disorder, but that can be very expensive to do, very costly. And estimating the need, getting the prevalence of a disorder does not necessarily translate into help seeking. We have to keep that in mind. Sometimes people do community surveys and find 100 people, let's say, with a condition. That does not mean those 100 people are going to seek care, or that they see themselves as needing to seek care. Neither do they see themselves as needing to seek care from our system. They may be seeking care from elsewhere, from churches, from traditional healers. There's also the challenge of standards and norms. for the various regions and populations of the world, and this is especially true for children. So measuring mental disorders among children is very challenging because the standards have to be established for each population, not just regions of the world, but specific for each population. And generally, measurement is very, very costly in mental health, very costly. Myself, if I'm told what you want to do a survey, or if you have $80,000 US, do you put it in a survey or do you put it in a service? I would put it into the service. What are the challenges with measurement if we continue extrapolating for a region in a country? This happens very often for the African region, which is I'm most familiar with, because we don't have a lot of studies coming out of the African region, neither are they countrywide. So we take a representative sample. Sometimes it may not be representative, but it is taken to represent the country. And then those few reliable countries, that little data then represents the whole continent. And sometimes this is not very accurate. We also have to be careful about medicalization. When you do, like I had PTSD, 87% of the population of the West Bank and Gaza having PTSD, that to me seems to lead to medicalization. Would that therefore mean that 87% of the population needs to be in treatment for PTSD? It can also lead to stigma and discrimination. I remember when I went to Afghanistan on my first mission there, it was in about 2003. And even at the airport, the one who came to pick us up said, "Are you labeling all of us as mentally sick?" There was already that resistance to having me there. So I need to rush it my time. Rehabilitation and recovery is often not considered, and this one I touched on a little bit. People who have been treated and they have recovered and they are in recovery or they are in rehabilitation, but they are still living with a mental health condition and living a full and productive life, are often never considered as recovered. That is a bit of a challenge in measurement. The potential opportunity, and there are opportunities actually, is to include mental health in other surveys. Is it possible to get a global mental health measure validated and include, for instance, in USAID's demographic and health surveys? Because that is one way that we could get a measure that we could then link and do association or studies, or even cohort studies looking at changes in population linked to these different measures. The other one is the living standards measurement surveys, and these ones have actually included mental health sometimes. I know they did include in the 2000s, they did include mental health in some of them. UNICEF and the World Bank have been doing multi-indicator cluster surveys for women and children over many years, and that would be another good opportunity. Some countries include a disability measure, a single measure that says, do you have a disability? And this could also be one way that you can measure these kinds of issues, looking at a whole population. If we could have one single measure that could be used, one indicator, I think that's the way to go. So in conclusion, mental health conditions are not one well-defined disorder, and a diagnosis is not necessarily an indication for treatment. I think I should also add here that a diagnosis is not necessarily an indication of not well-being. Well-being can coexist with a diagnosis. It is important to determine the purpose and then determine whether to integrate into other surveys, and more work needs to be done to refine or define new tools. The very last slide, a few steps forward, questions on mental health are being added to the WHO STEP surveys. So these STEP surveys have been carried out in a good number of the countries globally. In the African region, we have added some questions on mental health in some countries, Ghana, Tanzania. So some countries are already adding beyond the questions on suicide that were there. At the same time, WHO is developing a revised, expanded mental health module to be included in the steps. And this could be something that would then be used as the one maybe global indicator or one tool we could use that could be integrated into other survey instruments. And there's this GCC code that closes or closed today, looking into the context analysis of local mental health and well-being needs of young people. So I think that too will establish, begin to close the gap on the lack of data for adolescents and young children. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Florence, and for this interesting and very timely discussion, as we saw in the concluding slide. We're gonna head on to the next presentation by Andrew Crabtree, who is Adjunct Associate Professor at Copenhagen Business School and who works on nature-based human development and the human development approach, and has been a collaborator with to the Human Development Report Office on issues of human development, nature-based human development in the Anthropocene and how it connects to mental well-being. So Andrew, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Josephine, and for the other participants as well. Try sharing screen. I hope that works, perhaps. Okay. I say it starts with thank you for listening.
Working well, thank you.
Okay. You just get the... okay, right. Thank you very much. This is on nature-based human development and for mental well-being. I just want to make a preliminary comment about this because I'm looking at nature-based interventions, etc. I do not mean to say that everything is a question of nature-based solutions or semi-solutions to everything. I've done work on flooding, mental health and psychosocial consequences in Bihar following the 2008 Kosi flood, and done also literature reviews, and it shows quite clearly that consequences of flooding can include PTSD, depression, suicide ideation, addictive disorders, acute stress disorder, acute psychotic episodes, panic disorders, adjustment disorders, general anxiety disorders, plus psychosocial issues. I'm not saying that nature-based initiatives can solve all of these problems by any means. That's not what I want to concentrate, okay, on what nature-based initiatives can do. Looking at it from a human development perspective, I think traditionally the human development reports and the human development approach more generally has looked at the basics, often in relationships to poverty, but education and health obviously have been part of the Human Development Index, but also things like food, water, shelter, and also with human security. Most recent human development reports led by Pedro and the special report on human security have placed human development in the context of Earth systems science, and in particular the Anthropocene. And if we look at the Earth systems approach, then we see that human consciousness may be considered as the most recent addition to Earth systems. And what does this mean for our understanding of human development? I think we need to examine how human consciousness relates to our well-being. We need to understand how we are related to nature's opportunities, but also to the threats that we get from nature. This fits in very well, I think, with Christina's diagram, which included the entire body. But what we get here is that we see this is just a simplistic example of what the brain is going on, but various parts of the brain that have to sort of be in balance most of the time. And one of the points here that we need contentment, calm, relaxation, etc. That fills in very well with all the stress we feel in current societies. And the point here is that this is a basic need of human beings. So the approach here changes our understanding, I think, of what basic needs are. That we really need to look at how our brains work and how those are integrated into the basic needs or human development approach. What we get in the literature is that blue and green spaces help contentment, i.e. they are basic needs satisfiers. They're not the only ones, but they are basic needs satisfiers. There is strong evidence, a large literature on blue and green spaces that shows that they help well-being in subjective, hedonistic, or fluttering measures. And there is also a certain amount of evidence that they can help mental illness and treatments. One of the ones I've been looking at more recently, dementia affects something like 50 million people in the world. That is the equivalent of roughly South Korea. And I believe there's somebody from Colombia here. I think it's roughly the population of Colombia, just to give you an idea of how big this problem is. It is being found, more work needs doing on it, that blue and green spaces can help relieve dementia or prevent its development to a certain extent. That's an optimistic thing to think about there. It's not just blue and green spaces. An awful lot of the work has been done on blue and green spaces, parks and rivers, etc. And even though and a lot of it has been done, the research has been done in the north or China actually, but despite, say, America having huge differences in ecosystems in the country, they haven't done work on deserts so much or ice landscapes. In the north. There are a couple of quotes here just to say, okay, these affect me. We get one Inuit person saying, you have to know that the land, ice, does to a person. It just gives you that sense of freedom, identity. It's the best therapy that anyone could have in the world as a relationship to ice. And then there's a man from Jordan saying, many people go with a donkey into the desert for a few days to change, to relax, to think. It seems to me personally, I like this because it doesn't seem to me the most obvious way to relax, but people adapt to different contexts. So I think we have to bear in mind it's not just blue and green spaces, and blue and green spaces are very different, and it seems that there is no one type of human nature relationship that works 100%. There are differences for people everywhere. Looking at pandemic and planetary pressures, which the Human Development reports have been doing and the Human Security Report has been doing, what we see is that one of the major pressures has been land use change. This is the planetary boundaries image here. And these pandemics are often the result of people's, especially vulnerable people's, increasing contact with nature as a consequence of deforestation, agricultural expansion, intensive farming, the exploitation of wild animals and mining. And there has also been an increased trade in wild animals. The 2013 Ebola epidemic, which took place in West Africa, was a result of bats' immediate wildlife hosts, dynamic forest ecologies, and human-to-human transmission. Avian and swine flu influenza being the result of industrial production in Asia and US and Mexico. Excuse. And we don't know with COVID yet, but quite likely this come from similar issues. So planetary pressures here leading to COVID, which I'm going to look at, excuse, in the case of the UK. As I say, this is not just a straightforward relationship between what's on around and nature as such and mental health, but there are also root causes of the kinds of problems that exacerbate COVID. Austerity measures in the UK saw a reduce of expenditure on health from 42% in 2009 to 35% in 2019. That's just in a 10-year period. Rising child poverty and the closure of children's centres, decline in education funding as an increase in precarious work and zero-hours contracts, to a house affordability crisis, a rise in homelessness, to people with insufficient money to lead a healthy life and restoring to food banks in large numbers, to ignored communities with poor conditions and little reason for hope. Austerity will cast a long shadow of the lives of the children born and growing up under its effects. The British Medical Association at the start of the pandemic found that 80% of English hospitals were already in dangerously low capacity. Having low staffing levels, insufficient ventilators, protective equipment, insufficient testing capacity, 35% of doctors were already suffering from stress, anxiety, depression, or burnout. COVID had tremendous effects on people's mental health. Not surprisingly, health workers as frontline workers, excuse me, healthcare workers had moderate to severe levels of anxiety, 28%, and depression, 33%, and PSTD, 15%. And these were linked to a lack of protective equipment, pressure at work without protective equipment, a high workload, specific traumatic events, not being able to do enough, inadequate training, as well as worries about workers' own families and the possibility of passing COVID on. Another study of over 1,000 healthcare and social workers found that just under 60% met the threshold for clinically significant disorders, PSTD, 22%, anxiety, 47%, depression, 47%. Key factors including being worried about affecting others, the inability to discuss with their managers, problems with coping, stigmatization, insufficient supplies of personal protective equipment were also central issues. Families, finance and food security also played a role in the UK. The city of Bradford, 20% of females reported inadequate food security, with 9% stating that they regularly had to cut down on food or skip meals. An important indicator is the National Domestic Abuse Hotline in the UK registered a 25% increase in calls during the first lockdown. Sexual exploitation increased by 69% within the first 10 weeks of the lockdown. 80% of children stated that their mental health had become worse than prior to the pandemic. There was also an increase in eating disorders as people didn't know whether food was going to be there or not. So one coping strategy, and I repeat, it's not everything, was nature-based solutions. 89% agreed or strongly agreed with the statement that in general, green and natural spaces should be good places for mental health and well-being. What we see is that during COVID, that many people went out and visited nature, nature being a wide variety of areas, obviously some more accessible than others, but there were very few, and it decreased throughout the period, that had no visits to nature. Interesting reasons for not visiting nature. One is that obviously COVID restrictions in themselves, and the other is nature itself, bad or poor weather kept people inside, not surprisingly. What is interesting as well is that right at the bottom there, the light blue line says poor mental health or well-being. And that's interesting because if we want to help people through using nature and getting out into nature, then there is probably the possibility, the problem of getting people there in the first place, those people who perhaps need it most. Has the pandemic resulted in a permanent change? As one might say, okay, that was the pandemic and that was that, and things will change thereafter, well, and go back to normal. However, research suggests that nearly half of adults in England, right, reported spending more time outdoors than before the pandemic. Close to 4 in 10 say that nature and wildlife are more important than ever to their well-being. So there are win-wins if you look at cities, natural habitats for biodiversity and natural species migration, open green spaces for recreation, carbon sequestration, water regulation, preventing flooding, greener and healthier transportation, cleaner air, reducing pollution, and reduced temperatures, which obviously has a better influence these on climate change as well. Returning to the human development approach, if being in nature is basic need, then it ought to be integrated into policy. Couple of issues, examples here. Cities. If nature can play a preventative role in relationship to increasing ill-being, access to nature is crucial importance. By 2050, sorry, I haven't got the over 50% of the world's population expected to live in hugely diverse, expanding cities. Urbanizing China alone during the period 1980 to 2009 saw an increase of an estimated 431 million people, 431 million people living in urban areas. That's greater than the entire population of the United States. Access to nature in cities is unequal, usually along income, gender, age, young and old, disability, mental health, and culture relating to the historical development of cities themselves. Because there's benefits of living close to blue and green spaces, those areas attract the rich or relatively rich. So there's a gentrification. If you introduce blue or green spaces into an area, richer people move to that area. So city planning is central. I also want to end on a positive note as well. Here, education, as I said at the beginning, has been central to the human development approach, but within the human development approach, I think there could be stronger emphasis on the relationship between education and nature. One of the points that the UK cross-party group on nature study, with a nature-wide paper came out, is that we need scientists who are used to going in nature. And one of the issues was that schools themselves teach children via books, and kids don't get out into nature to do their research about biodiversity, ecosystems, etc. This is an interesting paper, the reference is there, looking at urban trees in schools in Niger, where they improve air quality, regulate school temperatures, have aesthetic values, apparently improve academic performance and urban food production, reduce conflict and physical violence in urban areas. And at the same time, the kids at school learn to identify different trees, but also not in the picture, also different insects and things like that. And they get to learn about the various ecosystems that are in their own schools. They can, of course, increase the amount of planting of trees in school, which have important human well-being benefits. They're not going to do everything, but it is, I think, an important initiative. And I do think we need to look at how this is related to our education systems. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, Andrew, for that presentation. And I think it's the perfect sort of segue into our second section of this webinar, where we will discuss or look at the types of policies that can advance mental well-being and what they can look like on the ground. So we will hear some examples from how these types of policies are implemented in different contexts. We'll start with Priyam Sarath, who is a senior economist at the World Bank, and she's currently on sabbatical from the World Bank to complete the doctoral work in organizational behavior at the Stanford Graduate School of Business. But her work has sort of been focusing on exploring how new capabilities emerge in economic actors like managers and firms through various cognitive and social processes. And she's going to tell us a little bit more about interesting research on cognitive behavioral training for conflict-affected entrepreneurs in Pakistan. So really how these mental well-being focused policies can be implemented in quite complex contexts. So Priyam, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Josephine and Christina. Let me just start by saying that thank you for the opportunity to present this work, which was done together with Julian Jameson and Tasmir Rahman. And as with any work, there are many institutions involved, from the World Bank to the WHO, whose curriculum we adapted, HDRF, that implemented this on the ground in Pakistan's Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and the FATA region, where this work was done, and the University of Liverpool. And let me just give you a little bit of context and try to touch on some of the most interesting, I think, details. But given the time, what I would also like to flag right at the beginning is that all these details have been published. So there are 3 papers. There are 2 of them, one which is a very detailed literature review of the kind of interventions we considered for this non-clinical population. Then there's another one, which is the summary of the results from the pilot randomized control trial, a practitioner manual. So, it has the surveys, it has some of the strategies we use to adapt the curriculum to sort of reduce stigma. So all of those are available online, free of cost, and feel free to look at those, because I will not be able to cover a lot of details given the time. So let me take a step back. This is, to my knowledge, it was one of the first non-clinical experiments, right, in terms of looking at the prevalence of mental health challenges, as well as what interventions could be used to
Priyam, I'm sorry, it seems like we're having some connection issues. Can you hear us?
a cash transfer project, that there were very high levels of distress, but this was anecdotal. And I was in the field for this work, and we thought, okay, why don't we just do a very simple study at the beginning to understand what is the prevalence rate, right? This is a non-clinical population, and it's a non-clinical population of high achievers, right? This is not a population that would consider itself to be at risk, and yet at the same time they are the engines of growth and jobs in this very conflict affected area at that time. So we did a survey, and we found that the prevalence rate was 35% in this group. And what was very interesting in this is, and I go back to a point I think Christina made at the beginning, is that the local interpretation of the symptoms of distress is not what you would map on to the kind of frameworks and paradigms we have for mental health in the West, right? So the language that is used to describe the feelings revolve very much around constructs of family, business, religion, and in order to set up the RCT, one of the practices and lessons that we did, and I would recommend very highly, is to always do deep qualitative work before setting up the intervention. And that gave us a lot of insights into how to set up the intervention. The intervention itself was a cognitive behavioral therapy intervention of 5 weeks, dosage of 2 hours per week, and both the control and the treatment arms, which comprised of these high ability entrepreneurs, both of them received cash transfers from a World Bank project. So we wanted to isolate the effect of financial distress, right? Because that sometimes can contribute to mental health issues. In this case, both got cash transfers, and the treatment group got the CBT intervention, while the control group got a placebo intervention, like a psychoeducation leaflet. And at the end of the 5 weeks, we measured the outcomes on depression, anxiety, well-being, and again at the end of 3 months. And the results were that there were meaningful reductions in the odds of experiencing both of these, and the treatment group was half as likely, more or less, than the control group in the odds of experiencing depression, as well as improvements in well-being. Just a couple of points, I think, towards the end of my comments. In terms of, there are a lot of limitations to this study, right? This is a pilot. This was done among 235 people because of COVID. We wanted to also look at the impact on business outcomes, but we weren't able to. So that's a very ripe opportunity for any researcher to try to understand whether mental health
Okay, hi Priyam. It seems like we're having connection issues still.
Okay. Is this better, Josephine? Are you able to hear me? I'm almost done.
Yes, if you would like to wrap it up, that would be great. Thank you.
Great. Sure. So just as a final comment, I would say that it's important also to think of scalability and of these interventions if you want to scale it. And we used non-health community workers who could be trained in 2 weeks in order to deliver this intervention. So with that, I wrap up. Thank you again. Happy to take questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Priyam. And I see that there's questions coming in the Q&A, which is great. We're going to have a chance to address some of them later. But let me then now move on to our next speaker, who is Sofia Ribeiro. And she's a mental health and psychosocial support officer for the IFRC in Geneva. But over the last 6 years, she's been working with mental health and mental psychosocial support issues within the humanitarian sector in a diverse settings, ranging from South Sudan, Palestine to Guinea-Bissau, to give some examples. And she's going to tell us about this type of work and what that entails across multiple and, again, sometimes very challenging and complex settings. So Sophia, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Josephine. So let me just start by sharing my screen, and hopefully this will work out. Can you please confirm that it is visible? Yes? Okay, thank you very much. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for the invitation to be here. So as Josephine introduced, I work for the International Federation of the Red Cross Red Crescent in Geneva, based in Geneva. And for those ones who are not so much familiarized with our organization, we're a membership organization representing 192 national societies across the world. And we're a very strong volunteer-based organization. There's more than 14 million volunteers across the world, spread by the many national societies. As a sector, MHPSS is one of our focus, or one of the sectors where we support our membership. And we do that both through our regional offices and also at the Secretariat with my support, and also with our Center of Excellence, the Psychosocial Center, which I'm sure many of you are familiarized with, which is more focused on knowledge development. So they produce manuals and tools, guidelines, trainings, which are open to the community, but very much tailored to the reality of national societies. And this is to say that national societies have a very strong community-based focus, and that's, along with the volunteers, something that characterizes us very much. So I would like to bring a little bit of what has been the journey for us, and try to bring some examples from different countries, talking about MHPSS, also on the challenges that we somewhat see across the world, but also some lessons learned, trying to inspire the discussion today. And I mean, some have already been mentioned by different colleagues, so seeing that some of the challenges are actually across the board and also from different entities. So to give you a bit of a broader overview of our membership, we conducted a survey in 2021. We actually started it in 2019, which is very much our baseline, to try to map what is, the provision of MHPSS services across our network. And what we know from this survey is that 153 national societies across the world actually provide some form of MHPSS services, being it for more basic or more advanced, technically speaking. These services can be provided in different ways. It can be integrated and mainstream, being that integrated means that there's a program where a component of MHPSS is embedded, but it still needs a specialist to run it. And an example of that could be like a livelihoods program that has a life skills program attached to it. For example, fostering resilience, problem-solving skills, communication skills, and so on. Mainstream, it means that there are elements of mental health promotion which are embedded in other delivery services, such as, for example, in relief of operations, the distribution of recreational kits for children, for example, or in medical activities, the distribution of leaflets with awareness on, for example, mental health distress. What does it mean? And what coping strategies could exist. As you can see, majority of the national societies actually provide these services in an integrated or mainstreamed way. Standalone means that it's a program that it just has a focus on mental health and psychosocial well-being. And just for your understanding, the don't know means that some of the national societies who received this survey they don't necessarily have MHPSS, but they still respond. So they may not necessarily even understand the question. And that's why you have some don't knows over there. But just to kind of portray that there's a wide reach in terms of our network in what concerns to the provision of MHPSS and psychosocial support. How we deliver MHPSS, as mentioned, we have a very strong focus on community-based interventions and also low-intensity interventions. So many of our national societies, they actually deliver psychological first aid, which is very often known as PFA. According to our survey, the same, almost 80% of our national societies actually provide psychological first aid. Another example could be setting up child-friendly spaces to support children's mental health through safe play. There can be also running dedicated phone lines and help points for people on the move. This is very much the case happening now in Ukraine and neighboring countries, where in many of them there are hotlines being established, mainly for supporting with the psychological first aid intervention, and of course having the linkage to for further developed services and providing referral to those services. There can also be another example, such as community engagement to promote positive mental well-being and address stigma often surrounding mental health conditions. And this can be done also, for example, through home visits, through awareness sessions. There's also programs to help vulnerable groups develop social and emotional skills so they can support one another. And a very popular way of doing this is what we call the life skills, which are basically social-emotional programs that are tailored to a specific target group. We do this a lot with youth and young adults, especially in conflict settings, protracted crisis, so in places where people are really challenged within their resilience. We, of course, when we talk about 192 national societies, I think you can understand we talk about a very diverse membership. So, of course, you will have national societies who are very strong and deliver very specialized programs, such as, for example, intervention with people which are victims of torture, for example. But indeed, the majority of our national societies are more focused on what we usually call low-intensity interventions. It's also important to recognize that there's a very heavy cultural element to this, right? So, for example, in Africa, national societies will very often resort to interventions through theater, for example. So theater in the communities is something that works very well as an awareness tool. Whereas, for example, in the Western, this will potentially be seen as off. So there are, different ways where national societies will then tailor to their culture their services. Also, to kind of frame how we deliver our services, we do have a framework which is shared also with another movement component, which is the International Committee of the Red Cross. And this somehow frames how we provide mental health and psychosocial support services. You will recognize here, many of you, the ones of you familiarized with the IAS pyramid, you will recognize here a lot of elements there. So I would highlight what is somewhat different in that. And the main difference is that for us, this framework entails the work both in conflict and emergencies and non-conflict and non-emergencies. And that we also understand that the provision of these services entail that there is a protective environment, because we understand that people need to be in a protected environment to be able to foster in terms of their mental well-being and resilience. So talking about policies, I'm going to tell a little bit about the journey that we have been doing and the role that an internal policy has had for our network. So in 2019, there were two very, I would say, milestone documents that were adopted in our international conference. One of them being a resolution for addressing mental health and psychosocial needs of people affected by armed conflicts, natural disasters, and other emergencies. And this was obviously adopted by our membership, but also by our member states. And there was also a policy where this framework also comes from on addressing mental health and psychosocial needs, which has 8 policy statements. This somehow is meant to bring us all together, again, trying to address the diversity of 192 national societies and really trying to focus on what is essential for all of us. Where do we see, the gaps, the challenges, the needs for a bigger focus? And in that sense, also kind of somewhat providing us a direction. This has been a long journey, I would say. So when I say this was adopted in 2019, the work towards this adoption started long before, somewhat 2016, the first steps. So this is to say that policies, especially when they engage so many actors, they take a lot of time, they take a lot of advocacy, they take a lot of side meetings with the people who in the end will accept to make this a global document, and a document that belongs to everyone. But also to add to that, the work didn't stop there. So one of the things that was very clear for the group of people working on these documents after they were adopted was the recognition that the work was not done. A policy could very easily, just end up being a document in a drawer that no one really reads in the middle of so many other policies. So in order to try to overcome that or to avoid that, a roadmap was developed as well. It's the last document you see on your right, Roadmap for Implementation 2020-2023. This roadmap somewhat tries to make the policy actionable and captures the policy statements into 6 priority action areas, and somewhat gives direction on what activities need to be carried out, what are the outputs that are expected. And the way that this was also pursued was with the creation of working groups, which come together roughly every month to focus on each one of these priority action areas. And similarly to what you were mentioning, Josephine, in the beginning about the challenges of bringing different time zones together, this is also a challenge that we face, and also the issues with language. But of course, we try to do the best with the circumstances we have, and we really try to bring together national societies to the table, make them own this document, and help them to reflect on how they can translate this into their activities. Then let me tell a little bit about the challenges, because of course the policy doesn't do anything. The policy was very important for those national societies who were already very strong in delivering their services. Somewhat it worked as the head of one of these national societies put it for me. It validated the work that they have been doing for many years, but for others, it was also a tool to start it. It's an advocacy tool as well. But many challenges prevail, and this is one of the questions we put out to our membership in our survey. What are the main constraints hindering the provision of mental health and psychosocial support services to our beneficiaries? And the number one challenge that is identified is budget constraints or limited budget. This was identified from 123 national societies, which I would say is huge, and it really sheds light on what we know to be one of the main challenges within this field, which is the limited funding. Another challenge that was identified was challenges within the organization. This can be a very broad category, I would say, and probably it would need to be a little bit entangled, but this can be things, from the buy-in from senior leadership to difficulties in terms of their mandate, because we do have an auxiliary role to the governments, and so the national societies are meant to support the government in those areas where the services are not being fulfilled totally. And the third challenge that was identified is lack or limited technical expertise, and that can go from manuals to trainings to the human resources. And this was mentioned by 60 national societies, and this is something that we ourselves see very often. It is that our colleagues would like to do more, but they don't have the necessary capacity to do it. And this is something that we try to overcome, for example, with the work in the PS Center and also with our dedicated colleagues in the different regions. But there are more challenges that I would like to add here. The first one is the understanding and recognition of this field. There's still, I would say, a lot of stigma around it, and stigma even in recognizing the added value for other sectors even, and also understanding, or let's put it this way, it's often not seen as a life-saving intervention. So when you're dealing with a multiple crisis, or when you have a very deprived community, this is one sometimes often disregarded area because maybe you don't immediately see the effects of it. You tend to postpone and yeah, to not address it at all, or maybe just to come within the resources a little bit too late. The other one is competing priorities. Then again, if you have very deprived communities, let's bring the example of Pakistan, which we know is going through an immense crisis where an incredible number of the population is impacted severely. Of course, it is challenging with many needs competing at the same time. It's public health emergencies, it's clinical needs, it's food, it's shelter, it's so many needs, and then sometimes it just becomes somewhat of a competing field, and then again, not always it is recognized the added value of mental health and psychosocial support to all those areas. Thing as, yes, you are distributing food, which is obviously life-saving, but if you're dealing with a stressful group of people, how do you handle that? How do you control a crowd, for example? How do you use the words properly? How do you address a stressed community member that comes to you and sees that he's not on the list and he doesn't understand? So things like this are not necessarily recognized, and in that sense end up not being prioritized. Then the lack of trained staff.
Apologies, may I just remind you of the time and just kindly ask you to start wrapping up? We're running a bit over time.
Thank you. Thank you, Josephine. Thank you for reminding me that. So lack of trained staff on the ground is definitely something that was already mentioned. Working with volunteers also has some specificities, namely the availability. It tends to be a little bit cycle in terms of their availability. When there are emergencies, people tend to mobilize more, but not necessarily they are retained then. The limited resources I have already mentioned, and data collection. Our colleague Florence, I think she addressed it brilliantly, so I will not expand more on that. And just to finalize 4 lessons learned to leave for discussion. One of them, that policies need a framework to make them actionable. So just having a policy doesn't necessarily translate into change and into action. Having a focal point is essential. While this might seem straightforward for many of you, in many national societies, this will not be the case. And there will be colleagues who are responsible for, sexual violence and for protection and for MHPSS. And that becomes also a little bit challenging in terms of moving an agenda forward. Low intensity interventions can be an entry door when there is some resistance in embedding mental health and psychosocial programs, such as the case with PFA. And finally, caring for staff and volunteers is also an opportunity to allow for the recognition of MHPSS when the organization sees the benefits within, and then can sometimes also be kind of an opportunity to reflect on what would this translate also if integrated in the rest of their programs. And I would leave it here. Happy to answer any questions. Thank you, Josephine.
Thank you very much, Sophia. So before we conclude with our final presentation, let me also draw speakers' attentions to the Q&A. There are some very interesting questions there for you, Andrew, for Christina, for Florence, if you would like to take some time and answer them in writing as well. And now we will then hear from our final speaker of the day, Mariana Sanz Uribe. She is the director of Links Corporation, Corporación Vínculos in Colombia, and she's a psychologist and systemic therapist who's been working on psychosocial and therapeutic processes at individual, family, and community level in Colombia. Within the framework of human rights, social constructionism, systemic approaches, and action without harm. And she's going to tell us about psychosocial interventions in transitional justice and peace building settings, in specific in the case of Colombia. So please, Mariana, the floor is yours.
Hi, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I don't know all the times where you are. I'm really happy to be here. This is like a great opportunity for us to share with you some ideas, some knowledge, and some of the practice that we have been doing in Corporación Vínculos in Colombia. So I'm just going to talk about three things really quick. The first is like a brief context of Colombia and the process of transitional justice that we are in, a little description of mental health and psychosocial work that we do in Colombia, and some ideas that we have found in the research about the impacts of forced disappearance in the victims. I'm gonna focus on this subject because we have found that it has a great deal of impacts in the health and in mental health of families that suffer of this issue in Colombia, armed conflict. So just, I assume you know, but Colombia is a country that has been suffering from an internal armed conflict for around 60 years. And in 2016, it made a peace agreement between the government and one of the principal actors, the guerrilla of Las FARC. And despite these peace efforts, the armed conflict has reconfigured and continues affecting people's lives, mainly in the rural region of the country. Right now in Colombia, we have many laws and legal framework for peace and victims' rights, but the reality is that there is a big bridge or gap between this legal context and people's situation. In this context, Corporación Vínculos is a non-government and non-profit organization specialized during 19 years in mental health and psychosocial care process for victims of social political violence, and promotes the construction of a culture of peace in transitional justice context. In this experience, and over the last year, we have carried out a research on the impacts of the comprehensive health of victims of forced disappearance, and we have found some key elements that can contribute to this discussion today. At Vínculos, we believe that the body is an expression of disease, memory, and pain, and that health is a complex and holistic issue in which physical health is related with mental and emotional health. In our psychosocial care process, it is common to hear complaints related to the experience of pain, suffering, and disease. These are expressed in the body, and they have remained there, becoming chronic and gradually deteriorating the living conditions of family members. I would like to share with you some testimonies or words of the people that suffer these issues, because I believe they can show us like the dimension or how they understand what's going on in their lives. So on the words of a mother of a victim of forced disappearance, she says, All my illness started the day my daughter disappeared. All the illness started the day she left. Additionally, these findings are consistent with the results obtained in epidemiologic studies carried out at national level, which shows that there is a higher incidence of chronic health conditions such as high blood pressure or diabetes are more frequently in people affected by the armed conflict compared to general population. This was a mental health survey that was made in Colombia in 2017. A comprehensive health perspective implies understanding that the body not only from its physical dimension, but conceiving it as a social field where experience, emotions are described, where meaning, sense, and language are produced. Meanwhile, incarnated wounds become a way of witnessing the unspeakable, the unrepresentable. For example, another woman said, I can't talk about my son. When they ask me about my son, my body doesn't respond. I can't control my emotions. That's a mother of a victim of forced disappearance. So we believe that illness and disease appear in the victims as a metaphor of suffering. Another example is, sadness for me turns into pain because sadness for me, apart from turning into pain, also makes me a person with depression. Depression for me is the same insomnia, is the same headache, and it may also be affecting the joints. That's the words of a mother. This approach from social and right perspective considers the affectation of victims have been produced in an abnormal context, the context of war. So experience of pain are mediated by macrostructural conditions, such as economical, political, and social and cultural contexts, which may or may not favor the recovery of life and victims' health. When victims don't get the health care and help they need, the pain is permanently renewed and not find truth, justice, and comprehensive reparation is a way of repeating violence and perpetuates the condition of the victim in their identity. For example, I cannot be calm. How can I be calm if I have not found my daughter? If I have not had an answer, the only way for me to be calm is to find my daughter. So if I never find her, I'll never be calm. When a person who is a victim of political violence brings their pain and expresses it through their body, illness or physical illness, they require a particular and specialized attention, which goes beyond just listening to the illness. They must have an understanding from emotions, meanings, representations, memories, and interpretations. In this sense, suffering can be understood as a multidimensional pain that materializes in a comprehensive story of the type, I can't live, and that is associated with the experience of multiple alignments and diseases that generate a perception of generalized deterioration of the health condition. Another example, I don't feel like it anymore. I'm not the same as before. I spend my time crying. They took my life. I can't sleep. I don't even get out of bed sometimes. I want to sleep and don't wake up. When I sleep, I dream with my son. He tells me that he's not dead. And in my heart, I feel that is so. I can't take a breath sometimes. I try, but I feel a pain in my chest and I feel that I can breathe. That's a mother of a victim of forced disappearance in Colombia also. So these findings lead us to believe, or this work we do with victims in Colombia lead us to believe that, one, it is necessary to make a paradigm shift and transcend the medical perspective that until now has prevailed, addressing the health impacts and experienced by people who have been victims of the armed conflict. We cannot continue to see like only the physical illness or mental illness. We believe that we need like a comprehensive and integrative approach. And of course, like many of you were saying before, we need to stop the violent cycle. We need to stop the war. We need to create peace conditions for building, for well-being and human development. Two, it is necessary to carry out studies that allow for greater understanding of the impacts on health from a comprehensive health perspective, with the aim of building coordinating care and psychosocial support strategies that allow mitigating the effects on health on the victims.
Mariana, can I kindly ask you to start wrapping up as well?
Yeah, this is the last one. And it is necessary to transform the relationships that we have built between the victims and the health system and its professionals. Also, it's important to build a relationship of trust that allows a dialogue of knowledge between scientific knowledge and the knowledge of people have about, and the knowledge that people have about what they are living and the health and disease conditions. And finally, it is necessary to create strategies and programs that can provide comprehensive care to the victims of the armed conflict with budget, opportunity, relevance, continuity, and quality. That is all I wanted to share with you. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mariana, for this very interesting presentation on the important work that you're doing in Colombia. So, dear audience, our speakers are answering questions live in writing in the Q&A. So please feel free to ask your questions there. We will now move on to a set of live questions that have been that are coming into us from the South-South Global Thinkers Network. This is a global coalition of think tank networks that facilitates knowledge sharing, expertise sharing to inform from the Global South to inform policy agendas. So our first question from one of their members is from Odette Kibu. Odette, please, if you would very shortly introduce yourself and then ask the question to our speakers. I think you are on mute still.
Sorry, thank you very much. I am Odette Kibu, public health epidemiologist and senior health policy analyst.
Oh no, it seems like we're having some connection issues. Perhaps yes, okay, perhaps let's move to our second intervention or second question from Giulio Straiano, and then we can get back to that if her network improves. So Julius, please very shortly introduce yourself and give your question to our speakers.
Thank you, Josephine, and thank you to the speakers for your very informative and relevant presentations. I'm a research fellow at the Center for Non-Traditional Security Studies at S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies here in Singapore. So we are a graduate school and a policy think tank, and my focus of studies on human security and human development. I just want to first mention or highlight the mental health access of mental health services to, for example, to migrant workers. I'm coming from the context of here in Southeast Asia, where there are many countries which are source of migrant workers, but there are also countries here in this region that are a primary or main destination of migrant workers. And Christina mentioned in one of her slides on the minority groups, you know, LGBTQ, women, etc. And I think I should highlight here also the importance of giving access to on mental health access for the migrant workers. The problem usually here is the national social protection regimes are inaccessible for migrant workers, and there are some studies here in the region that there are record number of mental health symptoms among migrant communities, and they are not aware of the kind of rights and services that they can avail, first from their home countries, and secondly from their host country. So probably my question is, what can countries and international developmental institutions do to change this problem, you know, the inequality between local communities, for example, and the migrant communities in terms of accessing affordable mental health services? And another question is for Andrew. Just a very short question. You know, in probably in Europe and in North America, the concept of smart cities have been popularized, but even here in Asia, countries have or city governments have been aggressive in changing the way how they govern, how they provide services, by making their cities more livable and through deploying smart solutions. So they have this now, the network of smart cities.
I'm gonna need you to ask the question, and we need to.
Yes. Yeah, thank you. So my question for Andrew is, how do you think this deployment of smart solutions by cities and adopting a smart cities as a policy approach can enhance access to nature-based solutions to mental health issues? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Julius. So first question on inequalities and migrants, specifically access to mental health support. Any of our speakers feel obliged to answer? Perhaps Sophia?
Yes, it is a complex issue, but I was thinking, for example, of the example of Ukraine. It's not so much on migrants, but thinking on different countries somewhat sharing a common issue, and that takes a lot of coordination, and that takes a lot of advocacy as well. So, for example, for Ukraine, we do have a specific group of MHPSS technical focal points from the different national societies who come together and who discuss, you know, the challenges. At the same time, there's strong support for coordinating the different services that are being provided to try to bring those national societies with less resources, try to bring them to an upper level for them to be able to respond. And at the same time, ensuring that also within Ukraine, the services are also being provided. With this said, I mean, it entangles many levels, right? It also entangles the issues of I would say things that are more on the governmental level, and that takes advocacy issues as well. And I think that's very much the role of all of us for the Red Cross Red Crescent network, you know, having an auxiliary role to the government. It is also their mandate, of course, to bring these issues. But yeah, it is challenging when you have multiple interests and multiple visions and resources. But I would say, yeah, the effort on coordination and advocacy is the essential thing to do.
Thank you, Sophia. Let's see if we can take Odette's question now. And Odette, I'm gonna have to ask you to be very to the point because we're running out of time.
Yeah, thank you. I will. So I was saying I'm Odette, Senior Health Policy Analyst at the CAF Policy Institute. My question goes to any of the panelists, because this issue of mental health, maybe conflicts exposes some of these persons to mental health. But the issue is when we come with the intervention, they still go back and live in that same environment. Is there, within your intervention, is there something that you do that, really take out these people from this environment? We can bring in the interventions, but later on they go back and, the process repeats itself again. So any intervention, is there anything that you're currently doing to help these persons with mental disorders?
Thank you very much, Odette. I'm gonna ask Andrew perhaps to address that, and also Julia's question on smart cities interventions, sort of in the environment that people are in, and how that sort of affects mental health issues. Andrew, any short reflections on this? I'm sorry, you're on mute still, Andrew.
Sorry, short reflection on smart cities was I was a bit surprised that you said they were thinking of it in Europe and Northern America, because the sort of example that comes to my mind is in South Korea. So something working in the other direction. I don't know. That's a quick answer. If anything, there's been one of the things that does worry me is about access for kids to nature. And for older people and things like that. An awful lot of the work that I'm reading looks at, okay, there's 10 minutes, 5 minutes, 900 meters to green areas. And it's a long way for a little kid if there's a big road in the way. And I think that, or for an old person or whatever, and those kind of sort of considerations need to be taken into account. If smart cities can do that, that would be really interesting. So that's the...
Thank you. Perhaps, Mariana, would you want to come in on sort of the conflict settings and having worked in conflict setting with mental health issues and being sort of, after the intervention, still having to live in these settings?
Yeah, I would like just to say that there's no way to get people out of it. We always do it in it. I mean, we go to the places where people are living the conflict, and we do the mental health and psychosocial support there. And we also work in building capacity on the community so they can support each other when we go, because that's the basic part. You have to live like capacity or build or help to build the capacity for them to address what they are living, because they cannot depend on like the therapist or the psychologist outside. So you don't get them out, you go in and help them build together, and so they can stay with that.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mariana. Florence, do you have any very quick 30 seconds reflections on the discussion?
Yes, I also had the very same response. Actually, we cannot take people out just because they have a mental health condition. The services are provided where the people are. That's what I wanted to say about that. In relation to the issue of migrant workers, there are different programs that actually provide services for migrant workers. NGOs in the cities where the migrant workers are. Some help them resettle, some help them get back home, because some go and then end up stranded. Maybe they don't get the job they expected. So like IOM, for instance, and IOM includes a mental health piece within the work it does. Many times they do have to transport them back home when they are not well. And the mental health care is provided in that package of getting them back resettled. The short answer.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Florence. Christina, any last add-ons and reflections?
Thanks, Josephine. Yeah, just maybe to mediate here between the different opinions and taking out or not taking out. I know, Odette, that you work in a context of gender-based violence, and so I understand your comment from a different angle. So from where you come, that is definitely the only way to go, and a very important comment, because when you treat, for example, and this is just an example, post-traumatic stress disorder of survivors of domestic violence, then the first and foremost important thing to do is to take the person out of the trap that I talked about in my presentation, the trap of violence and economic dependence. So I think this is probably what you meant, and this is crucial to make treatment effective. And in another context that we heard about civil wars or other armed conflict, this may certainly not be possible, which does not mean at all that it's not worth providing support to people who live in context of violent conflict. There's still a lot that can be done and that should be done. And I thank you so much for this very interesting discussion. As Pedro said at the beginning, this is the start of a conversation, and this is just the start of adding work on mental health and well-being into the human development approach. And I think this was a great start. And maybe Josephine, you would like to say something to close the event.
Thank you very much, Christina. No, just to thank all the speakers for taking the time to providing your insights and reflections on this very important topic. As Christina says, this is only the start of a conversation that will keep on happening. And as we've seen, we could have continued discussing the whole day, because these are important issues, not only on an individual level, of course, of the people who are suffering mental health distress, but also on a policy level. As we started with, there are important linkages between mental well-being and human development, and especially in this current context of the Anthropocene and multiple global crises putting pressures on our lives and on our minds. So thank you everyone for this interesting discussion, and let's keep the conversation going. You can find the Human Development Report on the Human Development Report Office's website, and do keep reaching out to us to continue the discussions. Thank you. That's a wrap for today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.